Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of Hank Earl Carr and a heartbreaking series of events that took place in Tampa, Florida on the 19th of May 1998. A day that would change the lives of so many forever. Hank was born in the early hours of the 31st of January 1968 after a difficult labour. He was born with hyaline membrane syndrome, a sometimes fatal disease that leaves a baby's lungs so stiff that they struggle to open them. At that time, survival rates for this disease were far lower than they are today, and in many cases, as the baby struggled to breathe, their chest muscles would tire and they would pass away. Hank survived, but as a baby and toddler suffered from ongoing breathing problems and also had severe asthma attacks. As a result, his mother, Gail, lived in constant fear that something would happen to her son. Hank was incredibly smart. He began walking early and was reading by the age of 3. His father, Harold, was a strict and unforgiving man, and his parents divorced when Hank was still just a young toddler. Hank lived with his mother, but still had regular contact with his father. Shortly after her divorce, Gail got married to a man by the name of Don Cox, and the family moved to Bradenton in Florida. When Hank started school, it was clear that he was incredibly intelligent, but he would not behave or follow the rules of the school. He was assessed as being in the top 1% for his age academically, and also diagnosed with an attention deficit disorder. By the age of 7, it was decided that he should be prescribed Ritalin, a drug that helps with hyperactivity but which can be habit-forming. The medication worked well for Hank, increasing his ability to stay focused and reducing his behavioural problems. His mother enrolled him into a variety of activities to keep him occupied. He learnt to tap dance, attended karate lessons and astronomy class. He enjoyed swimming and American football and developed a love of drawing and was hoping that one day he would become a cartoon illustrator when he was older. The family then moved to Barnesville, Georgia, when Don got a job at a glass factory that paid better than his work as a truck driver. Barnesville, which is around 60 miles south of Atlanta, is a small city that had a population of just under 5,000 at the time. It was a relatively quiet place where many families had lived for generations. Hank struggled to fit in, and by the age of 10 had become increasingly aggressive, had stopped listening to his teachers and parents, and would often shake down other children for money. Although small for his age, he was tough and strong. 5 years later, the family moved to Englewood in Florida, and against his mother's wishes, Hank's doctor took him off of Ritalin. After being on this drug for 8 years, the withdrawal hit him hard. He was plagued with migraines and nausea, and he became hyperactive, jittery and tense. He struggled to sit still and would eat his meals pacing around the room. It was around this time that Hank had his first run-in with the law for drinking alcohol on the beach and then breaking into a vending machine. His behaviour continued to worsen, becoming ever more disruptive and aggressive. His mother tried her best to discipline him, but without success. Eventually, believing that Hank's friends were a big part of the problem, she said that he could no longer see them. He refused. His mother stated that he could stay at home and follow her rules, or he could leave. So, at the age of 15, Hank left home. He became friends with another boy, 16-year-old Roger Lee Stables, who was also homeless. They would sleep in abandoned cars, get in fights together, and steal whatever they needed. Numerous run-ins with the law would follow. Hank was arrested for stealing a car and charged with battery, but did not receive a custodial sentence. However, at the age of 18, Hank was convicted of burglary, theft, and forgery in Sarasota County and sentenced to 2 years in prison. During his time there, he was determined to be viewed as top dog. Various infractions were noted: locking a guard in the prison freezer, wrapping a towel over an inmate's head and beating him badly, smashing an inmate in the face for changing the TV channel, attacking a kitchen worker and throwing stew into his face, to name but a few. One of Hank's reports read that Carr has a negative attitude and disregards all rules and regulations, and blames everyone but himself for all of his problems. Despite his behaviour, Hank was released after 18 months in the June of 1987. He was put on strictly supervised probation, but within minutes of meeting his probation officer, he had told them that he would not be sticking to their rules. He returned to live with his mother and stepfather and started work installing sliding doors. However, he had no respect for authority and was fired during his first week. Less than 2 months after moving back with his mother, she had kicked him out of the house again due to his difficult and violent behaviour. Living back on the streets, Hank regularly got into fights, and just as his probation was about to be revoked, he disappeared. However, by February 1988, he was back in prison after stealing a guitar. He was sentenced to 3 years, but was released after just 6 weeks due to overcrowding problems. At this point, Hank moved in with his girlfriend, 16-year-old Kathy Stevens. Kathy had moved out of her family home and was keen to take on a traditional wife's role for him. Within a month, Hank had started to physically abuse her, once hitting her so hard that her eye bled for a week. In the August of 1988, Kathy's parents arrived to take her home. She was pregnant and gave birth to Hank's first child, a boy, a few months later. In May 1989, Hank was back in prison serving a 2-year sentence for burglary, drug possession, and also assaulting a police officer. He was released after a year, but was soon in trouble once again for beating a man and threatening to gut him. He was put under community control, but disappeared after attending just one meeting with his parole officer. In 1992, at the age of 24, Hank moved with his then-girlfriend Belinda Simpson to Marietta in Ohio. Within months, Belinda had filed a restraining order to keep him away from her and her 9-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter. The court documents showed that at one point he beat the children for jumping on the furniture to the point where he caused the young boy to be bleeding from his nose and mouth. Hank agreed to attend counselling, but was thrown out of that for violent behaviour. Many of the women who knew Hank, even those who he viciously beat, described him as someone who could be very charming and that he could be incredibly romantic. But, as is so often the case in abusive relationships, once he had won the woman over, his behaviour changed and he would become incredibly violent. Those who knew him said that he always needed to be in charge. For example, if he didn't like the clothes that his girlfriend wore, he would simply rip them off of her. In the bars of Marietta, the violence continued. Hank once bit off a chunk of a man's ear, bragging that he was lucky, I gave it back so they could sew it on. He never had a job and would get attention and free drinks by performing backflips in local bars. He was eventually banned from almost all of them. One of his neighbours, Kelly Beaver, was assaulted by Hank. They still have no idea why, and they lost all of their front teeth as a result of this attack. In the November of 1992, Hank approached a woman by the name of Evelyn Sachs. This was outside the Four Seasons bar on 2nd Street in Marietta. As he approached her, he said, "You have the most elegant neck," and then proceeded to sweep her off of her feet. He was charming and romantic, but within a very short space of time, he had once again become abusive and violent. Within a year, Evelyn had suffered numerous beatings and, now pregnant with Hank's daughter, had been infected with a sexually transmitted disease and was repeatedly stolen from. In January 1994, Evelyn gave birth to their daughter, Tamara, with Hank telling his mother that it was the happiest day of his life. The relationship continued, but Evelyn discovered that Hank was having an affair with Bernice Bowen, a young mother of 2 children, a girl named Kayla and a boy, Joey. Pregnant once again, Evelyn left Hank, taking Tamara with her. She would later give birth to a boy who she named John Paul. Hank never met his son. As Hank's legal troubles grew and warrants were issued for his arrest, he and Bernice left on a motorcycle and went to South Dakota. They went on a spending spree with money that Bernice had made from the sale of a house. During this time, Bernice left her children with her mother, Connie. The couple then decided to set up home in Tampa, Florida, where they lived in a small garage apartment on East Crenshaw Street with Bernice's 2 children. Bernice worked at the local Kmart and also as a dancer at the Starlight Lounge strip club in Nebraska Avenue. Whilst Bernice was working, Hank looked after the 2 children. Bernice was often seen with black eyes and bruises on her neck and arms, which she would cover with makeup. Nevertheless, she loved Hank and said that she loved how good he was with her children. Those who knew her pleaded with her to get out of the relationship. Even their landlord was scared of Hank, stating that Hank would often be carrying multiple guns when he went to collect the rent. Despite being wanted in 4 states, Hank was able to trade guns undetected in Tampa by using an alias. There were also allegations of child abuse. Hank was anonymously reported for allegedly dropping Joey on his head after the small child had wet himself. Despite this, however, no signs of abuse were found. Others stated that Hank was very proud of the children and was very close to them, particularly Joey. On the 19th of May 1998, Hank, Bernice, 6-year-old Kayla and 4-year-old Joey were due to go swimming. However, they never made it to the pool that day, and what started out as a regular morning for all involved turned into one of the deadliest days in the history of Tampa Police Force. At 9:50 that morning, Bernice and Hank arrived at a Tampa fire station on the corner of Nebraska Avenue and Hannah Street. Hank was driving and Bernice was sitting in the front passenger seat of the car. In the back seat was Bernice's son, Joey. They rushed into the fire station and begged for help. Joey had been shot in the head. Despite the firefighters' best efforts, Joey could not be saved. Within minutes of Joey's death, Hank sped away from the fire station, returning home to the place where Joey had been shot. The police arrived, and a seemingly distraught Hank told them that the shooting had been an accident and that the gun had accidentally gone off, shooting Joey in the head. When asked, Hank gave his name as Joseph Lee Bennett. It was the name of Joey's biological father and a man who had no criminal record. Hank seemed cooperative at first, but suspicions were raised when he attempted to run off. However, he was quickly caught and taken to the Tampa Police Department to be questioned about the morning's events. Initially believing that they were dealing with a distraught father, it was agreed that Hank would be taken back to the house in order to walk the detectives through what had happened that morning. Something wasn't quite right about Hank's story, as he initially said that Joey had been dragging the rifle behind him when it discharged, but then said that he himself had been putting the rifle away when it accidentally went off. 2 police detectives, 46-year-old Ricky Childers and 44-year-old Randy Bell, took Hank back to the scene and at around 2 p.m. left to return to the police station. Less than a mile from their destination, Hank managed to escape from his handcuffs. His hands had been handcuffed in front of him, not behind, and, unbeknownst to the officers, Hank, a serial offender, always carried a handcuff key on a chain around his neck. Free from the handcuffs, Hank managed to grab Detective Ricky Childers' gun. He shot Ricky in the head, killing him instantly. The second detective, Randy Bell, tried to dive into the back seat to stop Hank, but he too was shot and killed. As Hank exited the police car, he shot at 2 truck drivers, one of whom, Christopher Espinoza, had to undergo surgery to rebuild his arm. The other truck driver, 26-year-old Kevin Luke, narrowly escaped a serious injury when the bullet hit the headrest of his seat. Hank then carjacked a 1997 white Ford Ranger and made his escape. He refueled and then headed to visit his mother. When he saw her, he told her that Joey was dead and that it had all been an accident. As he was leaving, he turned to his mother and said, "Mama, I got to go now. I love you. Kiss me. You'll never see my face alive again." It was clear that Hank had no intention of going back to prison. He headed towards Interstate 75 to start the 900-mile trip to see his daughter, Tamara, in Ohio. Less than half an hour after fatally shooting the 2 detectives, Florida Highway Patrol Trooper James B. Crooks spotted the stolen Ford Ranger just south of State Road 54. James drove up behind Hank on the exit ramp for Interstate 75. As the traffic stopped, Hank jumped out of the truck and opened fire. A 20-year-old student, Tim Bain, witnessed the shooting. He saw Hank walk up to the patrol car and fire 2 shots before running back to the stolen truck. As he did so, another truck driver who had also witnessed the shooting drove straight at Hank, trying but unfortunately failing to stop him. Meanwhile, the student, Tim, noticed that the trooper's cruiser was rolling down the exit ramp. He managed to reach into the car and stop it. The highway patrol trooper, James, was dead inside the car. A frantic police chase followed, with Hank often shooting wildly at the pursuing officers. Less than 30 minutes later, at around 3 p.m, Hank crossed the Hernando County line. Police officers were already waiting for him with a stinger to puncture his tyres. Hank retaliated by firing randomly. He hit the sheriff's helicopter, which managed to make a safe landing. Hank then pulled into a Shell petrol station, where he continued to shoot at the police whilst running inside to take cover. Here, he took 27-year-old Stephanie Diane Kramer hostage. Surrounded on all sides by a massive police presence, Hank had run out of options. A standoff followed. As the police negotiators were brought in, they soon found themselves competing for Hank's attention with a local radio station, WFLA, who Hank called during the standoff for an on-air interview. During this interview, he provided his true identity and stated that Joey's death had been an accident. However, he showed no remorse for the policeman or the highway patrol trooper who he had just killed. He was only concerned about himself and how much he did not want to go back to prison. Eventually, the negotiators managed to contact the local telephone company and prevent Hank from making outgoing calls, so his only option would be to deal with the negotiators directly. The police agreed to let him talk to Bernice, who urged him repeatedly to surrender and to let Stephanie go. Hank kept saying that he would free Stephanie, but would then change his mind. After 4 hours, he eventually agreed to let her go. She ran from the building to safety and immediately expressed concern for Hank, the man who had held her at gunpoint for the previous 4 hours. During their time in the petrol station together, Hank had told Stephanie about the events of that day, how he had shot 2 detectives and a state trooper, how his boy had died, and that he himself planned to die. He said that he planned to kill himself because he couldn't live with the thought that he had killed his child, even though it had been an accident. Stephanie kept her composure, stayed calm, and kept him talking. Before he freed Stephanie, Hank gave her letters for Bernice and Kayla, 2 photographs of Kayla that he carried with him, his shirt, and $180 that he asked Stephanie to pass to Bernice. He also pulled the handcuff key from his pocket, explaining this was how he had escaped earlier in the day. The cheap master key could be bought for just a couple of dollars at that time. Hank put it onto his gold necklace and asked Stephanie to give it to Bernice without the police's knowledge. With Stephanie now safe, the police made their move. Tear gas canisters were fired into the building, and the Tampa bomb squad set off 2 charges that were designed to blow holes in the walls of the building. When the dust cleared, they discovered Hank's body. He had shot himself in the head with a 9mm handgun. On the 20th of May 1998, a memorial service was held for State Trooper James Crooks. 23-year-old James had been due to marry his fiancée Nadine Lamont in November that year. He had always wanted to be a police officer and had been on the force for less than a year. Ricky Childers had been on the Tampa police force for 21 years. He was married and had 2 sons. Randy Bell had been on the job for 18 years and was married with 3 daughters, 2 stepchildren and a grandson. One of his daughters now works for the Tampa police force. Evelyn, the mother of Hank's children, would later state that she was glad he's dead. Live like that, die like that. Kayla was placed into foster care immediately after the attack, with both her mother and grandmother wanting custody. However, in 1999, Bernice was convicted of child neglect for allowing Hank near her children, and also with aiding and abetting Hank's escape, and being an accessory to the murders of her son and the 3 police officers. Even after one officer broke down and begged her to tell them Hank's real name, she refused to do so. Had the police known that they were dealing with a convicted felon from the start, rather than a grieving father, the whole day may have panned out differently. She was sentenced to 21.5 years in prison. In 2001, these convictions were thrown out on appeal as the state appeals court found that the prosecutors focused too much on what Bernice should have done to prevent Hank's rampage, rather than what she did after the crimes were committed. She was subsequently acquitted of being an accessory to the murders of her son and Trooper James Crooks. However, she was still convicted of child neglect, aiding and abetting Hank's escape, and being an accessory to the murders of Ricky Childers and Randy Bell. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentencing guidelines called for 6 to 11 years, but when sentencing her, the judge stated that her lies to the police were so egregious that they endangered the public. Bernice was released in October 2016. Kayla was raised by her maternal grandparents. That concludes today's case. My heart goes out to the victims involved in this story this week. Joey, Ricky, Randy and James, and also to all their respective families, friends and work colleagues. Also a thank you to Graham Nalepa for suggesting that I cover this case. Thanks Graham. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. This month is the 3rd anniversary of the Crime Reel YouTube channel. If you're a public subscriber, that means I get a little red button by your name, as you can see on the picture now. Any public subscribers that comment on this video, I will reply with what your badge shows. So if you see a 2Y, I think you'll know that means 2 years. Thank you so much for your continued support. Goodbye.